why the concept of Zone 2 and training for the uphill athlete has failed you. This is something that I've been wanting to talk about for quite some time. Throughout the course of my life, I used to think that doing a lot of volume was a cure-all, and books like Training for the New Alpinism and Training for the Uphill Athlete and the popularity and resurgence of Zone 2 base building has kind of entrenched people into this belief that the only thing that they should be doing is Zone 2. However, what I have learned both recently and early on in my training, that a majority of people, especially amateurs, essentially all amateurs, should not be doing Zone 2 training. And there's several reasons for it. Firstly, let's just go with the concept that Zone 2 training for most people is at such a pace that is so much slower than what Zone 2 is for, say, Killian or a professional athlete, that they're totally forgetting that you're not exercising the same movement pattern that you would be using during your race pace. In other words, if you have to hike or go at a 10-minute mile pace, that is not going to help you when you have to run at a 6-minute mile pace. The movement patterns are so different that you're not training sport specifically. Okay? So there's that component. You're not training specifically because you're just too slow. Secondly, you and I are amateurs because we're not professionals. Okay? So professionals are the way they are because like 90% is because of genetics and predisposition. Okay? And what this typically means compared to an amateur is they get injured a lot less because their movement patterns are more dialed. They have more efficiency. They utilize their musculature in a way that doesn't damage them as much. You and I don't have that, which is why we're not professionals. Okay, so if you think about it that way, if we at our best maybe have like an 80% economy of movement, we'll just make that up as kind of like an efficiency measurement. Okay, then that means that we're doing each step 20% wrong. And when you're doing a ton of Zone 2 volume, what you're doing is reinforcing poor technique. Okay, because you already have inefficient technique, as evidenced by the fact that you're not professional. Okay, and you're running slower, and running slower inherently is a poor technique, especially when it compares to your race pace. Okay, which is why loads of trainers all the way back to the beginning of endurance sports, in running in particular, have always advocated doing hill sprints. And they say you should be doing hill sprints because specifically it forces you to have good form. You cannot sprint up the hill with improper form. It doesn't work. You can jog up a hill with improper form. You can run on flat ground with improper form, especially at slower paces. Okay, so for an amateur, you actually are more efficient in as far as your form is better and more like a professional's at the higher velocities that you run. Okay? So that is why you should not be doing mindless Zone 2. You're reinforcing bad habits, okay, and you're not training sport specific. You're not training in a sport specific way. Okay, so how should you be training? Since you should not be doing a shit ton of Zone 2. Well, it's honestly kind of simple. Listening to a lot of strength and conditioning coaches, particularly in the endurance world, they'll say that the kind of less professional you are, the more strength training you should do. So in other words, people like Jacob Ingebrigtsen, they are going to be doing 2 strength workouts per week. And that is at the highest level. Okay, Olympians. They said that for people that are not as skilled, they're doing even more strength training. Because if you think about it, what strength training is, unlike what most people think it is not muscle building. Strength training is specifically neurologically teaching your body to fire its muscles in a sport-specific way. Okay? I know that's a lot to take in, but it's not about the muscle building. It's about getting things to fire in sequence the way that they're supposed to fire. And when you are not a professional, we've already established that you're not a professional because you don't know how to use what you have. Strength training teaches your body to move in the way that it is supposed to, okay, which should be your number one goal as an amateur. All right, so strength training at least 3 times a week, okay, and then the follow-up to that, what do you do when you are doing your sport? Well, I think it's been proven both recently in the form of the Norwegian singles method, and then even earlier back in the, I want to say it was 80s or 90s, by the easy interval method. And essentially what these are all derivatives of the same concept, which is sweet spot training, which is that running at a sub-threshold, approximately 7 out of 10 effort, gives you the advantages that are close to working at your threshold in VO2, except they do not beat you up, so you can do them more frequently. And from a training load standpoint, they allow you to accumulate training stress at a considerably more efficient rate than doing zone 2. For instance, instead of doing 15 hours of zone 2, you probably could get away with 9 to 10 hours of zone 3 to get the same training stimulus effect. Multiple multi-sport athletes have shown that regardless of how it achieves, their fitness is always correlated based off of their total cumulative training stress score. Okay, tracked, either via Training Peaks or Strava. Pretty much everything has metrics these days. But the point is, whether they did 20 hours of zone 1, 9 hours of threshold, or they did, some in between, a polarized approach as, training for the uphill athlete would have you do, where you're doing, 80 to 90% zone 2, and then with 10% above your second aerobic threshold, so your lactate threshold, so essentially VO2 max intervals, taking up the remainder. Okay, but for the amateur, doing too much zone 2 will beat you up because you're inefficient, and it's an inefficient way to accumulate training stress. And secondarily, VO2 max will absolutely destroy you because you're too weak. So ultimately, you have no business training a ton of zone 2 and training VO2 max. And while you might be able to survive it, it's definitely not as efficient as doing 3 times a week strength training and focusing on sweet spot training. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that the polarized methods do not work. I'm saying that they work for people who are already biomechanically efficient and professionals in their sport. That's why they are where they're at, because they're predisposed to doing that sport well because of movement economy. Okay? So, quite simply, you and I have no business training in a polarized approach because we do not have those inherent efficiencies. And our time is much better served doing strength training, which will teach our body to become biomechanically efficient, and doing zone 3, which will carry over in a much more efficient way to sport-specific adaptations, as far as running at those speeds is actually closer to your race speeds, so you're training the same movement pattern, and it is cardiovascularly efficient and in a very efficient way to accumulate training load. So anyway, there's my quick rant. A couple other things that I wanted to address. First, I wanted to be clear that zone 2 training absolutely works for the person, like I said, who's not limited by their movement economy, which is not you. Okay, so what I mean by this is that all of these studies that purport the efficiencies of zone 2 training are all true. Zone 2 training is the most efficient way, obviously combined with 10% or so of VO2 max training, to grow cardiovascularly, especially like at a high level. But the whole point that I'm trying to make is that you and I are not limited cardiovascularly. and we are limited more from a specific muscular endurance standpoint. Now, this is evidenced by a multitude of things, but the easiest way to think about it is this famous rock climber was once asked, what's more important, power, I forget if it's strength or power, or endurance, to which he responded, if you can't hold on to the single smallest hold, what is there to endure? Okay. And the parallel to that, obviously in running, is that you can watch influencers try to run, Kipchoge's, marathon pace, like, 440 mile pace. They can't do it for 100 meters. Okay. So you and I shouldn't be concerned about endurance because we don't even have the strength to run at these paces for any amount of time, let alone for a reasonable amount of time. Okay, so we should be entirely focused on our movement economy and our specific muscular endurance at higher velocities, like that you would get out of zone 3 training and like you get from neurologically training yourself with strength training. Okay, only once we can endure these faster velocities is it worth pursuing something that starts adding on a bunch of volume. And for the people, like I said, that you see that are successful with zone 2 training, it's at the point when the gap between their zone 2 and their threshold or race pace is so narrow that their zone 2 is like incredibly hard. Like really efficient zone 2 athletes, like Olympians and stuff, like Kipchoge is probably running, 5 minutes something miles in his zone 2. Okay, so the carryover of him running in zone 2 then carries over a lot more to his race pace because the velocities are so close. But you and I don't have that problem because the velocities are nowhere near close, right? Like I can run, an 18-minute 5K without really training much, but my zone 2 pace, if I wasn't training much, is going to be like 9 or 10-minute miles. And that gap of 4 minutes per mile does nothing. It does nothing except cause abuse of joints, and it doesn't make you faster. Okay, so the second point, in addition to just talking about, like why you would choose zone 2, the second point I want to get to is how do you actually implement this? Okay, specifically. Okay, and I think that there's a couple of things that need to be addressed, and it's a lengthy enough topic that I'm going to save it for another video. Out.